In early 1941, while most of the world was still fighting with piston-engine aircraft, a small team of German engineers at Heinkel were testing something that seemed almost impossible: a jet-powered fighter. It was called the Heinkel He-280, and it was unlike anything that had ever flown before. Sleek, fast, and powered by two revolutionary jet engines, it had the potential to change the course of the air war before it even began. Yet history would barely remember it. The He-280 would become a symbol not of German innovation, but of how bureaucracy, politics, and arrogance can bury even the most advanced ideas. The story began in the late 1930s when Dr. Hans von Ohain, a brilliant young physicist, developed one of the first working jet engines. His ideas caught the attention of Ernst Heinkel, an aviation pioneer who believed that the future of flight lay beyond propellers. Heinkel was bold. He built experimental aircraft at his own expense, often without official approval from the Luftwaffe. In 1939, his company achieved the world's first jet-powered flight with the Heinkel He-178, a small proof-of-concept aircraft that roared through the air for 6 breathtaking minutes. When Heinkel proudly presented his invention to the Luftwaffe, expecting excitement and support, he was met with polite indifference. The high command saw jets as interesting curiosities, too complex, too expensive, and unnecessary when conventional aircraft were winning battles across Europe. Undeterred, Heinkel moved forward with a new design, a combat-ready twin-engine jet fighter. The He-280 was years ahead of its time. Its airframe was sleek and aerodynamically refined, built entirely of metal and featuring a fully pressurized cockpit, tricycle landing gear, and even an ejection seat, something unheard of in 1940. It was powered by 2 small axial-flow jet engines mounted under its wings, each promising thrust far beyond what piston engines could deliver. By the end of 1940, the first prototype was ready. But there was a problem. The engines weren't. Jet propulsion was still in its infancy, and the HES-8 engines designed by von Ohain suffered constant delays and failures. They overheated, lost power, and often exploded. Still, Heinkel pressed on. On April 2, 1941, the He-280 made its first successful flight, towed into the air by another aircraft, since the engines were not yet ready for independent takeoff. But even this limited test stunned observers. When the engines finally began working reliably enough to power the aircraft by themselves, the He-280 became the first true jet fighter in history to fly under its own power. For those who witnessed it, the sight was unforgettable. The aircraft accelerated like nothing before it, smooth, almost silent, leaving no propeller blur. In later tests, the He-280 easily outclimbed and outran Germany's best piston-engine fighters, like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf FW-190. Test pilots reported that its performance was astonishing. One pilot, Fritz Schaefer, famously said it could fly circles around anything in the sky. Yet the He-280's greatest enemy wasn't the Allies. It was the German Air Ministry. The Luftwaffe's procurement system in 1941 was slow, fragmented, and ruled by political favoritism. The main rival to Heinkel, Messerschmitt, enjoyed far stronger connections within the Nazi leadership. Willy Messerschmitt, a shrewd businessman and an opportunist, knew how to court power. He had the personal favor of Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, and Milch, his deputy. When Messerschmitt proposed his own jet fighter, the Me-262, the project immediately received high-level support, even though Heinkel's design was already flying. Heinkel tried to convince the Air Ministry that his aircraft was ready for mass production, but officials delayed their decision, claiming they needed more tests, better engines, or clearer military doctrine for jet fighters. Behind the scenes, they were already diverting resources toward Messerschmitt's competing project. Ironically, while the HE-280 was performing successful test flights, the Me-262 was still struggling to leave the ground. But politics decided which plane would live and which one would die. The HE-280's development continued through 1942, with several prototypes tested under increasingly difficult conditions. In one dramatic demonstration, Heinkel arranged a mock dogfight between his jet and a Focke-Wulf FW-190, one of the Luftwaffe's best fighters. The HE-280 completely outmaneuvered the propeller-driven aircraft, proving beyond doubt that jet power was the future. The Luftwaffe observers were impressed, but still, no production order came. By now, the war's momentum was shifting. Germany's once unstoppable military machine was being pushed back on all fronts, and resources were growing scarce. Fuel, materials, and manpower were being rationed. The Air Ministry wanted to standardize production and focus on existing aircraft rather than gamble on untested technologies. The bureaucrats argued that jet fighters used too much fuel and that their engines were unreliable, both true, but short-sighted. The HE-280 could have been refined and improved with proper support, but the opportunity was slipping away. By 1943, the HE-280's engines, the HES-8 and later the more advanced HES-30, were finally becoming reliable. The aircraft could reach speeds approaching 800 kilometers per hour, far beyond anything else in service. But by then, the Luftwaffe had officially chosen the Me-262 as its standard jet fighter. Heinkel was ordered to stop development of his project. The company tried to pivot toward building bombers and components for other manufacturers, but the HE-280 prototypes were quietly dismantled or scrapped. Only a few ever flew.
The Me-262 would eventually enter combat in 1944, almost 3 years after the HE-280 first took to the sky. It was an extraordinary aircraft in its own right, but it came too late to change the war's outcome. By the time Germany's jets reached the front lines, the Allies had overwhelming numerical superiority and total control of the air. The HE-280's early promise, a chance to revolutionize air combat years earlier, was lost to politics and pride. Looking back, the HE-280 stands as a symbol of what might have been. Had it been developed and produced when it was ready in 1942, it could have given Germany a technological edge during a critical phase of the war. A squadron of operational HE-280s could have outpaced Allied bombers, challenged air superiority, and forced the Allies to accelerate their own jet programs much sooner. But it was not to be. The HE-280's fate was sealed not by engineering failure, but by human failure, by a system that valued influence over innovation. After the war, Allied engineers studying captured German technology were stunned to discover that the world's first operational jet fighter had been built and abandoned years earlier. The lessons learned from Heinkel's work would quietly influence post-war aviation on both sides of the Atlantic. The British Gloster Meteor and the American P-80 Shooting Star, both of which entered service by 1945, owed part of their design philosophy to what Heinkel had achieved in secret laboratories years before. For Ernst Heinkel himself, it was a bitter legacy. He had pushed boundaries and believed in progress, yet his greatest creation was denied its place in history. The HE-280 remains one of the most fascinating what-ifs of World War II, an aircraft that could have changed the air war forever, but was buried under politics, ego, and the fog of war. It was the jet that arrived too soon, the machine that proved the future had already come, only for its own creators to turn away from it.